Today, I'm talking to one of Ukraine's leading cultural figures and most creative minds about a very personal and difficult subject, the intentional flooding of Kakhovka by Russia in an act of monumental depravity and barbarism. We'll also be talking about how culture and food fortify the Ukrainian identity and strengthen their spirit of resistance against tyranny. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help people find our great speakers on YouTube. And do, of course, please consider becoming a patron to support the work we do. Olia Hercules is a food writer, food stylist, and chef who spent her early childhood in the town of Old Kakhovka. She is author of many award-winning cookbooks, including Mamushka, Kaukasis, Summer Kitchen, and Home Food. She settled in the United Kingdom at the age of 18 to study international relations and Italian at Warwick University. Olia Hercules began working as a chef after completing a course at Leith's School of Food and Wine in 2010. In response to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Olia raised money to privately send bulletproof vests to civilian volunteers in the Ukrainian army, including her brother. With her friend, the chef Alisa Tomashkina, she established the Cook for Ukraine social media initiative, encouraging businesses and individuals to raise money by cooking Ukrainian cuisine. She's won many awards, including the Observer Rising Star in Food 2015, and was winner of Fortnum and Mason's debut Food Book Award in 2016. Well, Olia, I could list your accomplishments and it would probably take the entire interview, the entire hour to do so. Well, Olia, welcome to the channel. I'm delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start with the tragedy of the man-made disaster in the Kherson region. And rather than sort of talking about sort of facts and figures and a distance, let's start with an intensely sort of personal take. And we've just seen the first photos of what's left of the amazingly beautiful house of Polina Reika. And there's huge damage. And it's incredibly upsetting to see those images, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really hard to describe how it feels, really. It's nothing that I've ever felt before. Comes close to, obviously, the 24th of February was such a huge shock and trauma. But this is entirely something else. Even then, when the war started, we still kind of had dreams and hope that maybe, we will be able to go back. And with something like this, that possibility, we're still hoping and we're still not losing hope. My hometown, Stara Kakhovka, which is kind of like a 15-minute drive away from Nova Kakhovka, was actually on the spot which was flooded in the 1950s when they released the dam. So now that the dam was blown up again, it's the opposite effect. So the water has retreated from the reservoir shores. So actually, my parents and my grandmother's house is kind of like safe, but obviously, the devastating effect of everything that's going around is yeah, it feels apocalyptic and yeah, truly catastrophic, and still trying to process it, to be honest with you.
And that raises, I think, a very pertinent question, because clearly an individual like you who knows the area and has very nostalgic close memories of the area, it's going to have a huge impact. But the images are apocalyptic, the images which everyone can see right from the first hours of the tragedy. And what I don't understand is that the media immediately seem to flip into a kind of both sidism type way of analyzing it, or lack of analysis. There was even the chief foreign correspondent of the BBC saying, we will never know who actually did this. The fact is that on the second day, within 24 hours of the tragedy happening, already seismic data was emerging. That started to point the finger. We knew that the dam had been mined by the Russians. We had reasonable suspicion that the only way to cause a disaster of this scale, because of the extraordinary engineering behind that facility, would be to mine the service tunnels, which only Russia had access to. So the media has been not even, I would say, impartial, extraordinarily weak, almost appeasing. Well, let's tackle that first, and then secondly, what the implications of that are in
Sure.
order to hold Russia to account.
Yeah, as soon as they moved in, as far as I know, they've mined the dam, and actually, from what I know, of course, I'm not an expert, but from what I've been reading, it's actually, this kind of infrastructure is built to sustain, you know, kind of really hard hits from above. So that's not how you blow it up. You blow it up from within, from below, and that's what they did. Whether they intended to blow it up as much as they did, we will never know, but we know of the level of incompetence of the Russian forces and their leaders. I mean, the fact that they've allowed soldiers to dig up trenches in Chernobyl, and to lie in those trenches, just shows us the complete disregard for human life, whether it's the enemies or their own. At the moment it feels a little bit like scorched earth policy as well. If we, maybe they're expecting a really strong counteroffensive, that they know that it's coming, and they just say, well, if it doesn't belong to us, it doesn't belong to anyone, and that's it. And yeah, so it's but for us, to think that we would be capable of that, that was really hurtful. That felt really, really, it stung, because also people don't really understand and know the history of the dam's construction, which, exactly pretty much the same thing happened. There was the river Dnipro, with its little rivulets and people living in these floodplains and, living their lives, and then they build a dam, they build a reservoir, and they flooded so many villages, historical burial grounds, Zaporozhsky Siege. Of course, also about 30,000 families were just given 3 days to leave their houses, because the shores of the Dnieper were to be flooded, and there was bulldozers that were coming and just taking those houses down, and some people refused. And I've actually interviewed my family from Kakhovka who's lived through it, and I've done quite a lot of reading and historical research in the past year about this. And in the 1950s, there's this sentence that I read, and it said, pigs, cows, people, houses, it's all floating, floating and dead. And you just think, they did it to us again. They did it to us again. It's so it goes beyond it. We know the cost, and we know the catastrophe of that. Why would we ever do that to ourselves? Why would we risk the nuclear disaster, which would completely annihilate us? It just doesn't make sense. And it does hurt, and it does make me extremely angry that there was this two-sidism, and people are just, I don't know, thoughtless, stupid. I don't know how to explain it, but it was a very stupid and damaging thing to do, and people really should think twice, journalists, etc.
And the narratives come in a couple of flavors. And unfortunately, I mean, one reason this channel was created was to try and address the flaws in the media process and the lack of knowledge, both regional knowledge and historical knowledge, which can lead to propaganda being able to make headway in Western news. That's not even including the useful idiots and the people who consciously amplify propaganda messages. But there seem to be sort of two camps, neither of which I think are correct. One is the we'll never know, shrug your shoulders, and really not try to think about things. That at this point, 14 months or so into the war, is completely unacceptable, because we've seen so many examples of Russian incompetence, absolute viciousness. The second one, and I've seen this from many, I would say, actually very sensitive observers and analysts, many who are extremely pro-Ukrainian, that they still come at this from the point of view that Russia is making rational decisions. that their decisions are born out of some military logic, some political logic, and still not embracing the idea that it could be sheer incompetence, or even worse, spite. And this is something we talked about yesterday at the excellent event you were part of in London. And I think this idea of scorched earth and Russia being like a sort of abusive, murderous, jilted ex-partner, this must start forming part of people's analysis of the situation, rather than still considering Russia to be a rational actor.
Absolutely. And it's kind of embedded in the even within life in Russia, as you mentioned. I mentioned it as well yesterday, that they're acting like an abusive ex-partner who says, well, if I can't have you and I can't have the children, I'm going to kill you both, and then I'm probably going to kill myself. There's no rationality in that. But if you look at at Russian policies of recent years as well, at their attitude towards domestic abuse, where it's pretty much goes unpunished, you can towards both women and children, it's that it's extremely abusive all throughout, very totalitarian, very abusive, and but that's the myth that they've created throughout the years, or the great Russian literature, or I don't know what they had to boast during the Soviet years, but there must be something if that kind of thing endured. But they've never ever had to apologize for any of the crimes that they've done historically. Russian Empire continuing, morphing into the Soviet Union, which actually was a continuation of the same kind of attitudes. Come in, settlement colonialism, launch that, get the locals out, deport people thousands miles away, separate families, bring Russians in, forbid the use of language, burn the books, everything that they've done during and post Second World War. We've never, Ukrainians and other ex-Soviet countries, none of those people have ever received an apology or even a recognition of what they've done. And that's where they sit, and that's where, because we haven't done anything wrong, or they just don't acknowledge it. But unfortunately in the West, people don't quite understand it, or they, I'm surprised at how many people don't know so much of the history, how many people don't know about Crimea. Quite intelligent people that read, and people that are probably on the Ukrainian side, but they still don't know that in the early 1940s, they took out 200,000 people of Crimean Tatars, the indigenous population of Crimea, who had a really beautiful way of co-living with nature, of extracting water in very respectful and fascinating ways, using these almost ancient Iranian canals, etc. And they just came. They took 200,000 people, mainly women and children, because all of the men were fighting on the Soviet side. They put them into cattle trains, and they sent them to Central Asia. Half of them died on the way. They were just throwing bodies out of the train. I did exactly the same thing to people all over the Soviet Union, including to my own grandmother. So my grandma was a daughter of a wealthy peasant. I mean, they had like 2 horses, a cow, and they employed 2 people twice a year to help harvest and whatever, and that was considered to be a wealthy peasant. And there was 4 children, and my grandma was 11. And they arrested my grandfather, dispossessed them, so took all of the animals and house, put my grandma and her mother and the children into a cattle train, or even not even a cattle train, but like a merchant, like commercial train, so no way to breathe or anything. Lock them in and send them off to on the border, northern Russia, on the border with Karelia. Threw them out in the middle of winter into a forest to fend for themselves. Four of them, one of the kids disappeared, but the rest of them survived and somehow made it back to Ukraine, and miraculously reunited with my grandfather, who meanwhile was going through Holodomor, the forced starvation. There's so much of this stuff that it's just a cycle of abuse that we're encountering on such a huge, genocidal scale. And now it's a culmination, and we're finally united enough to say, no, this is it. This is the end. We're going to fight until the end, basically. This cycle needs to close. And I don't want to pass on any of this intergenerational trauma to my children. So I'm also working on myself and trying to do anything that I can, interviews, writing, whatever, to help this, to make people understand, to help people that don't know this history learn it, and to feel us, and to feel how we feel, and to know the details of the crimes that have been perpetrated for years and are still committed now.
And we can extend that to nature as well, because this is, when I was studying the history of the period, I mean, firstly, the Holodomor was not taught nearly enough, and I think that's changing now. But also, the very aspect of Stalin's industrialization was again often tackled in quite a rational fashion, and the sheer inefficiency of it, and sometimes the strategic pointlessness of many of the industrialization processes, weren't really properly examined. Again, we're trying to impose our own economic rationality on that system. But the one bit that actually shocked me was the idea that many of these projects, like the Kakhovka Dam, were designed to essentially subjugate nature, control nature, again, if you want to personalize this, in an extremely violent way, like an abusive husband would assault, his partner. That was the intent, not accidental.
No, they talked about it openly. They said, in our modern socialist society, we need to, literally, they said, we need to subjugate nature. Nature has to kneel before us because we are the great men, and we're going to, bend it to our will, and we're going to make it do what we need to do. Whereas, of course, it's complete bullshit. How can you do that? You start breaking even the smallest kind of like ecological system or whatever is already existent. We all know that now. I don't know if they were being completely idiotic or just so megalomaniac, and kind of this whole feeling of I am God, God-like sensations that Stalin and his henchmen have experienced. I don't know, but yeah. And having done research on this, how they constructed the dam, I did find a couple of there were a couple of Soviet scientists, engineers, and that said, well, actually, and they weren't talking out of love for nature necessarily, but they said, oh, well, actually, these floodplains in the in the Dnipro River, they actually do provide amazing pastures for cattle, and they are extremely fertile lands that are already used for growing. If we get rid of them, the industrial centers that we're creating are actually going to not benefit from that kind of situation. And they were not listened to, and it was just like, yeah, damn, flooded, the big sea, everything big, strong macho kind of situation. It's very kind of patriarchal, and as you said, yeah, quite abusive. So yeah, absolutely.
And again, if we look at the problem, I think there's another one of the media fallacies here, and they'll quote numbers, X number of thousand houses, X number of people, etc. The topic of drinking water actually being toxified, made toxic throughout the entire region is not covered at all. I haven't really seen that really mentioned anywhere outside of
Beyond the region as
beyond the
well.
region. Yeah, the impact beyond the region, not even really touched upon yet. But that doesn't bring home, does it, the individual tragedy? And I think one of the things that stood out for me yesterday was we might talk about 16,000 homes or 8,000 homes, etc. But actually, each one of those people is seeing the collapse of their individual world, their house, their garden, their entire life they've invested in. And these numbers
All the people
can't
too,
convey it. Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt you. And a lot of most of the people that remained were older people. I had we're doing this with my friend Alisa Timoshkina. We've been given a grant, and we're doing these free workshops for refugees. And this woman came came over for this workshop, and she's from Odessa, and bless her heart, she was, you know, in Odessa they mostly spoke Russian, but she was trying so hard to speak Ukrainian, which I thought was so beautiful. But she said to me, she was in her 60s, I think, maybe early 70s, I don't know, and she said, you know, this is the end of my life. That's it. You know, it wasn't the easiest life, and I was there. You know, I had my children, I had my grandchildren, I had my little dacha or a little house, and I was growing things and whatever. And you know, and she wants, because she's, and you know, she was able to leave, and even then it's completely heartbreaking. But to imagine a life of someone who couldn't leave, because so many people, you know, in occupied areas, or even in areas, you know, from my hometown, couldn't leave because they either were too ill or old themselves, or they were looking after people that were, you know, their dependents that couldn't be moved at all. And so many of them, especially on the occupied areas, are now found face down underwater.
It's deeply tragic, and I recently saw John Sweeney's film Eastern Front, and I think that brings it home, because the only people really that featured in that film, which is very much about the battles around Bakhmut and that area, almost everyone you see in that movie is you know, they're in their 60s or older, between their 60s and their 90s. And someone in the audience said, well, this isn't representative of Ukraine, because Ukraine is a very young country, very vibrant, etc. And, you know, what you've shown here is a wasteland, you know, populated by the elderly and the weak and the infirm. And I think the filmmaker made the point that that's the reality as they found it. And as you say, people with physical, mental handicaps, people who are old, people who have, you know, their animals and their small holdings, fear that if they leave that behind, they'll have nothing, and they'd rather end their days there if need be.
Absolutely. And needless to say, you know, there were still children there, and that's just really hard to process, kind of, and to even think about. But also the animals, you know, the big animals, like you can see cows being washed up together with roofs of houses on the shores of the Black Sea in Odessa. You know, that's 300 or more kilometers away from Kakhovka. You know, they've seen dogs that have survived and made that distance on debris. Um, and you know, and that's just the big animals. Then there's the little ones. There's this tiny little mouse. Now I can't remember the correct name, that it's only existent in that area of the world. It's a unique animal that's been endangered already, and they're at risk. And you see all of these volunteers, you know, like saving obviously people, and also saving, you know, these tiny little mice. And it's that kind of side of it gives me hope. But then on the other side, if you look at the occupied part, where, you know, volunteers are trying to rescue people, and they're being shot at by the Russian occupiers, and that doesn't even, I don't even know if I have a place in my mind to even start comprehending that. That's
Yeah.
just barbarity of another level.
And it's the reaction to that barbarity being so sort of muted and often ambiguous, which I think is shocking. And the last question I want on this segment, because I think I think we've conveyed the impression of it, but it is deeply painful to talk about it. And this really, you know, links into something we were talking about yesterday, which is that Putin's mindset, his gangster mindset, the worry is that we're still not understanding what motivates him. And that is that he is not provoked by people standing up for themselves. He is provoked by weakness and not being pushed back against. So the divided and insipid reaction or lack of reaction to this act of terrorism may actually encourage him to go further rather than desist. And of course, we also suspect, in fact, we know that the cooling system in the Zaporizhia nuclear power station has been mined. We also learned from the talk yesterday that even though it's not actively producing electricity, the Russians have kept one of the reactors ticking over. And this is extremely worrying, because there's no economic, rational argument for them doing that. And it points towards the idea of another potential terror weapon. Now, I don't think if they did that step, it would stop the Ukrainian offensive. It wouldn't give them any real advantage. But again, it's more of this scorched earth interpretation.
Exactly, and as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, I'm not a psychiatrist, but Putin, as you say, comes from this gangster mindset, and from a like quite horrific, from what I know, deprived childhood. So there's a complete lack of empathy, and is pretty much a psychopath. I think he's kind of like cold-blooded. There's nothing there, behind the eyes, I don't think. And no, absolutely, but the way to deal with a bully, and as I said it yesterday, every 3-year-old knows how to do it. You just have to like hit them on the nose really hard straight away, and then they back off. It's that kind of simple. It's that kind of basic psychology here as well. He's completely, you show force, he'll back off. You kind of relax, he's gonna be emboldened and do more. And it was the mistake made initially when he went and razed Grozny to the ground in 1999, and people still, and then a couple of years later he was crooning, singing the song to Hollywood actors. Like, it just doesn't compute. And then he went to Georgia and did that, and then he went to Ukraine in 2014, and there was still the gas pipeline. I'm just, how? What were people doing? Why? I mean, maybe back then they were still like, oh no, yeah, he's, I don't know, rational, just evil, just pure evil and dangerous. And as you say, absolutely hit him straight away on the nose. And this is our last chance to do that, I feel. This right now, what's happening now with the dam, people wake up. I don't know if people are listening, write to your MPs, go to protests, keep showing the governments that you care, and that actually, it's all of our lives. I live in London, my children are here, but if there is some kind of a nuclear explosion, we're all going to be affected horrifically. Leave alone people in Ukraine. That's a catastrophe. But if nobody cares about Ukrainians, think about yourselves. There should be some kind of a self-preservation, and force is the only way. I'm telling you, force is the only way. I'm 100% convinced, because, well, we can see it from what's been going on. There hasn't been enough force, and he keeps going and going and going, and it needs to stop now before it's too late.
And to an extent, internally within Russia, I think a lot of people are waiting for that pushback and force, and it's not coming. They're either, too timid or don't have the political machinery to fight back themselves internally. We for various reasons, we know that there is no political life really in Russia. But they don't see the West pushing back or inflicting real penalties for his behavior. So, why, in the Russian mindset, why should they take that risk and do it?
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to something hopefully more positive. I mean, well, none of this is massively positive, but one of the propaganda lines, really, and I think what drives Putin's mindset is he did not believe that Ukrainians had agency. He did not, and does not, I think, even believe that Ukraine is an entity with its own independent language, culture, and history. In some ways, his ignorance combined with his maniacal imperial desire, and all the Soviet propaganda that he's been brought up on, and then his own propaganda, which he's overdosed on. I don't think he believes Ukraine is a real entity. So he expected that when he invaded, there'd be no real support for the elites, because that's how Russians work. Look at the bombing of the Podmoskovia, the suburbs around Moscow. People were cheering it because it was the Russian elite who were being targeted. And ordinary Russians were like, great, we don't care about these people. He thought Ukrainians would be the same and not support their elites. He couldn't have been more wrong. And I don't think it's because Ukrainians have, huge loyalty to their politicians and politics, but it is because you're united in an understanding that there is a culture, that you share, even if you don't necessarily, trust your politicians. You share some common values which are worth defending.
Absolutely. I mean, there was an interesting thing that Timothy Snyder said in one of his lectures when he talked about the Jewish people and the Ukrainian people, and how, there's been these notions that they're not nations. The Jewish people didn't have their land, and we didn't have our kind of like political, order, like a nation state, yeah, that united us for a very long time. And to me, on the contrary, that was, in terms of Ukrainians, despite the fact that we weren't united by the state, we've created a beautiful language which has been, oh my God, hundreds of times, forbidden, suppressed, Russified, etc. Despite all of that, it flourished. Despite all of that, all of this beautiful poetry, literature, art exists. Despite that, a house like you mentioned the house of Polina Raiko. I'm sorry I couldn't talk about that because it just kills me. Again, I've been researching her all year. For those who don't know, there was this woman who picked up a brush when she was 69, after her daughter died, and her husband died, and her son was abusive and alcoholic, and she was from this town of Oleshki, which has been completely ruined by the flood now. And she picked up the brush and she just started painting her house, and she became famous actually because it was just such a beautiful thing that she created. She worked through grief, and she grew, and she actually drew everything around her that really inspired her. So the floodplains with the birds, with the cranes, and the spoonbills, and the turtles, and I don't know, the plants. It was just such a beautiful little, very regular clay house, like all the generation have around the Leshki. And she's been gone since like early 2000s, I think, but the house turned into a museum, and it inspired so many people, including myself. When I've been working through my own grief last year, I started painting walls in my house, which is, of course, also is another part of Ukrainian tradition. We famously paint these beautiful flowers and things before big holidays, religious holidays in Ukraine, which started somewhere in the 19th century or even earlier. All of these, there's a lot of beauty that we created. There's a lot of beauty, and actually quite a lot of it is intertwined with nature, with locality, with us living and knowing our surroundings. And this is what it is. This is for me what a nation is, or whatever you want to call it. This is for me what being Ukrainian is. Yeah, it's being connected to my first of all, my ancestors' stories, which are tragic as well as very beautiful, to the culture, to nature, to earth, to growing, which from that comes this delicious food and everything. So you don't need a state. And we've always been extremely democratic. It's always been about the people and about freedom and about not being enslaved by someone else, and we've fought really, really hard throughout the years. And finally we get somewhere, and they decide to, they don't like it, they decide to annihilate us. So, in terms of the nation thing, he knows nothing. He understands nothing. He has no sense of, it's just emptiness, I think. It's just coldness and emptiness, and he cannot understand us. He never will. And that's, I don't know what to say. It's horrific. And he's so closed off. There's, I think he lives on a map or in his own head, or I don't know what it is, but we exist, we love, we create, and we will continue to do so.
And it's an interesting process, isn't it? Because it's this again, the thing that frustrates me is that when people say it's Putin's war and that this process started with Putin, well, actually it predates Putin, and the aggression against Ukraine, even since independence, predates him. Even in the 90s, there were various attempts, failed attempts, to try and take back Crimea and exert control over Ukraine. And there's a pattern, isn't there? And I'd be interested to hear how this relates to food. We'll get onto the subject of food and food and identity, and how that really has helped Ukraine exist and coalesce around its leaders. No matter how much distrust people might have for them, people will be able to coalesce around that and find common ground. But there's an imperial pattern, isn't there? Either you suppress culture and you destroy it. If that doesn't work, you look at which bits of it you want to steal. So cultural acquisition has been a big part. We can relate that back to food, especially, and the Borscht Wars.
Yep.
And then the third one, if you can't do any of those, or you can't turn that culture to your imperial needs, then you do what the Soviet Union did. And you say, okay, well, this Ukrainian stuff, it's all very nice, isn't it? But it's a peasant culture. And then you denigrate it and you put it onto a secondary tier and below the imperial culture. So that seems to be the three strategies that they employ. You destroy, you steal, or you malign and mock.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's a lot there. Yeah, definitely. Funnily enough, in terms of food, well, it may be until now, but with food, I feel like in kind of everyday people's lives, I definitely think that borscht is Ukrainian, but I don't think that Lithuanians or the Polish or, they can't cook it or whatever, I think authenticity in food is very fluid in a way, and also you can't kind of like completely own it in this kind of like, this is mine and you're not allowed to cook it, and if you do, then you're appropriating. Like I love cooking Indian food, I love cooking Thai food, I love cooking French food, and I want to keep doing that, and I think that's okay. And I think also it's okay for recipes to travel and for people to find different ingredients and adapt the recipe to their lives. I think that's kind of its sustenance, as long as you don't like, obviously there are cases when I don't know, a white person opens a Chinese restaurant and pretend, you know what I mean? Like there's definitely cases where it can also be a horrific thing. But in terms of borscht, yeah, I don't know. For ages, it was just like, yeah, that's okay. We make a much better borscht than Russians, like that's 100% a thing because of our ingredients as well, because of the tomatoes that we grow or the beetroot, or whatever. Like we just have this incredible, know-how y- and skills and knowledge, and actually the regional kind of variety of the dish is also, it's huge. I traveled around Ukraine to record recipes for summer kitchens, and I have a long essay about borscht actually in that book, and it struck me how much, again, from your locality, from what's around you, are you in northern Ukraine, historically around the marshes, historically people used to use elves, tiny little eels, to put into borscht. Crazy. You go down south, you get borscht where we make this massive halushka and stuff it inside a rooster's bottom, and then you cook it all in the borscht. And also we dry this, like gobies fish and use it in borscht. And there's just the variety, the amount of different borschts that I've seen all around Ukraine makes me feel like, oh gosh, this is definitely our number one dish. Like this is just something that's second nature to us. It's not just like, a Soviet thing where, how they standardized the recipes during the Soviet Union. For those who don't know, there was a big kind of push towards standardization, including for food and recipes. So any kind of local food knowledge was discouraged. There's even kind of recordings of the Soviets making people take their kind of like homemade cookery books out and burning them in the bonfire. And they created, a couple of kind of like standardized books where you have one recipe for borscht, one recipe for plov, one recipe for, I don't know, harcho, something from, and each dish, kind of like symbolizes each Soviet country, and it's great. But none of the kind of like individual little bits, all of that was, discouraged, to say the least, if not completely suppressed. So it actually wasn't such an easy thing to find all of those old recipes, but we managed, and we found so much, and it kills me how much is being lost right now, how much more research we could be doing. And all of these people, the older people, as they say, oh, but the older people, they actually, apart from being, humans, amazing humans, there's also so much knowledge and history that's been destroyed and that has gone with them. So yeah, so food is a funny subject, but as I say, yeah, borscht is an incredible Ukrainian dish.
That's a fascinating take on it, because it makes me think. I was talking to a sort of French Russian lady who was monitoring elections in Russia, such as they are. And we were sort of talking about the almost impossible subject, which is how on earth can you retrieve the situation from where it is? I mean, there is no solution. But I think we came to the conclusion the only way is to build from the bottom up and start with regional identities and start with regional power bases and local democracy. There's no way you can fix this from the top down. And it triggers a question here which you may not know the answer to, or it may just be, highly speculative. But it seems to me the suppression of local identity, the suppression of local cuisine, is not just about a Soviet process of standardization for economic reasons. It seems to me that it is a very political process to try and prevent people from coalescing, creating identities, and any kind of, ground up democratic evolution. Do you see the suppression of food culture as political?
Yeah, absolutely. So a very quick kind of story, which I hope will illustrate something and will perhaps maybe answer your question a little bit. I grew up, as I say, in old Kakhovka. As people might know, eastern and southern Ukraine were particularly hit hard by the Russification program in everything, in language and culture. I everything that I knew about Ukrainian culture would be probably through like Nikolai Gogol's books and illustrations, something like that. So in the 1992, I think, or 94, 92 maybe, we decided to go 94, just a couple of years after we gained independence. We decided to go on, my parents decided to go on a pilgrimage to Western Ukraine. The further you were from the center, from Moscow, the more you were able to preserve of the folklore, of food, embroideries, whatever it is. And we went in winter. We went for Christmas, and we arrived in Ivano-Frankivsk, and our friend's friend meets us, and he goes, okay, now we're going to walk. Everybody walks here. We don't have transport. We're in the mountains, somewhere in Carpathian Mountains, quite high up. Because we're going to walk to my house. It's a very short walk. And we walked for about an hour and a half, like 5 children, 5 adults. This guy kind of leading us, but it was amazing. It was such an incredible experience, all of the snow, and it looked like a fairy tale. It looked so different from kind of like a slightly drab winter in the Ukrainian steppe where I'm from. And also, culturally, I grew up around these kind of scraggly bones of Soviet architecture, of these like gray Khrushchevkas everywhere, and you can just, watching old movies, you can just see all of these beautiful Ukrainian houses. None of them were left by the time that I was born. So when we went to Western Ukraine and we arrived at this person's house, it's just beautiful wooden house, not big, but just gorgeous, in the middle of nowhere in the forest. At night we could hear like wolves howling very nearby, and in the morning you could hear this brook kind of trickling by, and it was just complete magic. And the Christmas celebrations, including food, were just incredible. There was a room out the front where the hostess of the house, cooked all of these kind of like cold hors d'oeuvres and laid them out on the table. And then people would come over, kaloduvati, which means, it's almost like a mini folk opera performance. So people will come with cymbals and flutes and these beautiful embroidered coats and sheep coats and goat masks, and all of this stuff that I've only ever seen in books was there in front of me. And they were fed, and they were given they were given all this food, and then it kept going on day after day after day. And as I say, like, this house was like in the middle of nowhere, like it wasn't even like close to the village or town or whatever, but people knew to come and to do this. And my conclusion was, in the end, that they sow communism, the word communism, it kind of like supposed to come from the word commune, or something that's kind of like this thing that unites us, but it doesn't work on the huge grand state. Nothing works on this gigantic, centralized kind of idea. You can't do that. And actually, for the you know, I've always known kind of the community and closeness of my big extended family, you know, more than 40 people. I've always known that, but I didn't know my neighbors in the south of Ukraine. I didn't know, you know, there was no community, there was no hromada. I never felt it. Everybody was actually quite like, if it was Christmas, you went secretly, you know, with your little sack, you went and you gave, you know, everything was on the D-low. Here, you know, up in the mountains further away, it allowed to be preserved. And what it was individuality, that, you know, rather than everyone being in this gray coat, people being so different, in a way, you know, so bright and colorful and interesting, but then this community also actually really existed. When one could flourish, everything around them flourished. If that makes sense. I don't know if that made sense at
It
all.
does, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I
As well
was
as you
born
said,
in.
people getting together and sharing something, you know, and yeah, we were deprived of that in the south of Ukraine.
I mean, I was born in England, but have relatives in Ireland and studied at university in Scotland. So I got that sense of a far more local sort of community spirit there, and
Yeah.
traditions that survived there, which some hadn't survived in England or in such a diverse way. And I think it's interesting. Tradition, again, is an interesting one, because I first went to Russia in '92, and before then at university, which I started the year earlier, I was very much involved in sort of music and various things like that, environmental work and so on. And what really struck me going to Russia was that whenever you went to see, you know, a folk tradition or a dance or something, it's what you mentioned earlier. There would have been a canon, a canonicalization of things, right? Like, we find all this diversity and we'll pick one variation of it, and then everyone's going to have to do that thing. And whether that's in national costume or dance and in food, as you mentioned, it's a way of systematizing, not just for efficiency, but actually for killing the life in that cultural tradition. You ossify it, you turn it into almost like a pantomime or a parody of itself. And it seems to me the Ukraine embodies the opposite of that, which is these traditions somehow have been preserved as living traditions, which means you can innovate them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea that culture cannot exist without innovation, and this is one of the aspects of Ukrainian strength.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So culture and innovation, yeah, and that, you know, of course, and it can only happen when you're free, when you're free to develop and what are my thoughts on this? Sorry, I'm just trying to gather them together. They're kind of like scattered around like butterflies in my head. Um, I guess we haven't had that much time to do it yet. I feel like it was coming. I feel like it was getting there, even, you know, looking at modern art and fashion and literature and film. You know, you can take those elements of you know, of, you know, folkloric knowledge or colors, embroideries, whatever, and yeah, you can carry it forward, you know. And I think we were kind of on the way doing it, and I really hope that one positive thing that will come out of this war is that some of these things will actually be kind of a little bit accelerated, you know, not just in culture, but um to have some I don't know, let's just say, for example, even LGBTQ rights, yeah, or women's rights or anything like that. I think we were moving towards that. But I feel like what would have taken about 5 years, I think people are really moving fast now with that. Sorry to divert into another thing, but it's an interesting kind of observation to see how many people from the community, from LGBTQ community, went to fight, you know, men and women. And unfortunately, at the moment in Ukraine, you know, there's no, the marriages haven't been legalized, and the partners of those who, for example, die or are wounded don't have the same rights as a heterosexual married couple, you know. But you see so much, at least on social media and in the news, that people are pushing forward. Especially, I feel like maybe my generation or even a younger generation, the people that are in their 20s, the people that have witnessed Maidan, they're very forward thinking. And I think, you know, we do have such a, whatever, even if it sounds like a cliche, I think we do have such a bright future within them, you know, and I can see that in their attitudes. And it's not all perfect, of course, but I can see that in so many ways, the war is accelerating quite a lot of positive change.
And really, the sort of last question to focus on really takes the cue from what you've just said there. And I think the first question is the importance of females in leading this change, because you'll see that actually the majority of my Ukrainian speakers on the channel are female. I mean, that might be skewed because so many people are at the front and it's more difficult to speak to them. But I actually also get the impression that people that are actually leading the change in civil society, that this generally does reflect what's happening, and the fact that females are taking an extraordinary leadership role throughout society and culture. The other one, of course, is the accelerating trend, quite rightly, that, you know, people find it painful to, in some circumstances, you know, speak and read in Russian. It's an individual thing, it's rather than a state thing. But many people whose primary language was Russian previously and would have understood Ukrainian but not been quite so fluent, many people, especially if they're younger, are now making the effort. And there's a huge push away from using Russian in everyday life, which perhaps would not have happened without Russian aggression. It would have been quite multicultural. But if you combine these two things with people discovering their roots, strong female leadership who tend to drive a lot of cultural change and transition from generation to generation, you know, what does that say to you about the future of Ukraine with these trends?
Actually, you know what? I've been feeling so, I try to keep super positive. You know, I've got my very small children, I've got my niece to look after, I've got my parents in exile, my extended family in exile, my brother is, you know, in the territorial army. And I try to keep positive every day and resilient and hopeful. But for the, you know, since the dam blew up, you know, obviously still early days, but I do get moments when I feel this complete hopelessness, which is destructive. And actually, you know, what's the point if you lose hope? You know, as John Steinbeck said in the, you know, his Sea of Cortez diaries, you know, there's a really beautiful quote about hope as being this conductor of life. You know, if you lose it, it's game over. But what you just said actually just gave me, thank you, it just gave me a really huge kind of boost, kind of like I don't know, almost like electricity, a big boost of hope and strength and courage, because I did think about women and how strong Ukrainian women are, and that we are our grandmothers and our mothers' daughters, you know. And in my darkest moments, I think about my grandmother and about her deportation and about what she's been through and about her still going through life and bringing up 6 children. And actually, you know, without Ukraine being necessarily like an overtly a matriarchal society, I think there were pockets of, and, you know, not kind of like Western feminism or anything like that, of course, but this kind of like, Georgians have a really good name for it, dedakatsi, mother man. You know, my granddad came back from the Second World War and he was traumatized, and he was very quiet and subdued and very gentle, despite everything that he's been through, imprisonment, etc., imprisoned by Stalin twice, you know. And my grandma, I don't know how, but this kind of just like huge power that she had, and she was kind and fair, but she was also, you know, like straight backed and really firm. And she did bring up the 6 children, and one of the first things for her was like amazing education, you know, even though she only finished, I don't know, 3 classes or something, amazing education for them. And all of that energy kind of like seeped through to my mom and my aunties, my uncles, these 2 of them, and to me as well. And when you mentioned that, and I thought about all of the women that come on to your podcast, or the women that I've met in the past year, which I would never have met probably. I would actually, to be completely honest with you, I was a little bit removed from the Ukrainian community. I've been here and I've been kind of tooting the horn of Ukrainian culture to any Westerner that would listen, and obviously, you know, some of the Ukrainians that live here, etc. But since the war, I've been able to connect to some amazing women, journalists, activists, writers, environmentalists, and men as well. But yeah, really quite a lot of women have been at the forefront. And thank you. I feel stronger now, and I feel like we can do it. We can really, really do it.
That's probably a good place to end, an extremely and unusually positive note, given the terrible things that we've discussed. It's good to have hope, which just derive from Ukrainian resilience, and in large part from the sort of culture and the desire to innovate that culture rather than see it fall into oblivion. Olia, I wish you good luck with all your endeavors. I'm very grateful to you for speaking to our audience today, and obviously would love to repeat that experience in the future. But thank you for everything you do.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, gave me strength. Thank you.